John and Sophie found themselves in a difficult situation, each dealing with their problems in their own way, but their lives were drifting further apart. After John's company went bankrupt, his world collapsed. He rarely left the house, isolating himself in his room and refusing to talk even to Sophie. He kept trying to find work, but constant rejections only deepened his depression, and their financial situation worsened with each passing day. John felt like a failure, endlessly replaying moments in his mind where he might have prevented the collapse. He avoided friends and family, embarrassed by his circumstances, and the weight of his perceived inadequacies became unbearable. One morning, Sophie hesitated in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker as it sputtered to life. John shuffled in, his disheveled appearance a stark contrast to the sharp, ambitious man she'd married. "Morning," she said softly, trying to sound normal. "Morning," he muttered, pouring coffee without looking at her. "How's the job hunt going?" she ventured cautiously, knowing it was a sensitive topic. John stiffened. "The same. Nothing new." Sophie's hand tightened on her mug. "Maybe you could reach out to Mark. He's in HR. He might know someone hiring." "I don't need pity connections," John snapped, his tone defensive. "I'll figure it out." "I'm just trying to help," Sophie replied, a mix of frustration and sadness creeping into her voice. "We're in this together, John." "Are we? Because it doesn't feel like it anymore." John shot back, finally looking at her, his eyes tired and hollow. The words lingered in the air like a bitter aftertaste. Sophie, on the other hand, tried to stay resilient, realizing that the responsibility for the family now rested on her shoulders. She got a job at a large law firm. She was offered the position of personal assistant to Richard, the managing partner, a confident and influential man who commanded respect throughout the office. The job turned out to be more demanding than she had anticipated. Long hours, endless calls, and tasks requiring meticulous attention to detail. Yet, Sophie quickly proved her competence, earning praise from her colleagues and building a reputation as a reliable problem solver. The salary allowed her to cover the bills, bringing at least some financial stability back to their household, but it came at the cost of her time and energy. One late evening, as Sophie gathered her things in the office, Richard approached her desk. "Sophie," he began, his tone warm but serious, "you've been working late almost every night. Are you doing okay?" She paused, caught off guard. "Oh, I'm fine, just trying to stay on top of everything. There's so much to do." Richard smiled gently. "You're doing more than that. You're holding this place together. I hope you know how much I value your work and you." Sophie flushed. "Thank you, Richard. That means a lot." He hesitated for a moment. "If you ever need someone to talk to about anything, my door's always open." "Thanks," she said again, her voice quieter. Their eyes met briefly before she turned away, suddenly feeling exposed. With each passing day, Sophie became more absorbed in her work, while the tension at home only grew. John, withdrawn in his depression, became increasingly irritable, lost in his own thoughts. Every day felt the same: coffee, a brief attempt to search for jobs, and then hours of watching the news or scrolling through job boards, which only deepened his despair. He stopped engaging in hobbies or activities that once brought him joy, and his interactions with Sophie became perfunctory. He didn't notice Sophie's exhaustion or the weight she carried. Oh, despite her professional success, felt lonely and deprived of the support she so desperately needed. At night, when she returned home, their interactions were limited to a few obligatory phrases. One night, Sophie walked into the living room after another late shift. John was on the couch, the television casting a blue globe over his tired face. She stood silently for a moment before speaking. "Do you want to talk?" she asked. John didn't look up. "What's there to talk about?" "About us, about how we got here," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "I feel like I'm losing you." John exhaled heavily, his gaze fixed on the screen. "Maybe you already have." The words hit Sophie like a punch to the chest. She swallowed hard, unsure of what to say, before retreating to their bedroom, tears stinging her eyes. At work, Sophie started noticing that her efforts were appreciated, not just for her professional skills. Richard often praised her hard work, sought her opinion on key matters, and occasionally asked about her personal life. His tone was always courteous yet attentive, and Sophie found this comforting. For the first time in a long while, she felt that her efforts and dedication were truly seen. Initially, she perceived their dynamic as nothing more than the usual relationship between a boss and an employee, but with each passing day, their connection deepened. One evening, Richard offered her a ride home. "Are you sure?" Sophie asked, clutching her bag. "It's out of your way." "It's no trouble," he replied. "You look exhausted. Let me do this for you." In the car, their conversation drifted from work to life. Finally, Richard glanced at her. "Sophie, I need to say something. I admire you not just as an employee, but as a person. You're remarkable." She frowned, unsure how to respond. "That's kind of you to say." "It's the truth," he said earnestly. "You've been carrying so much, and you do it with grace and strength. I just hope someone reminds you of that." Sophie felt a lump rise in her throat. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she simply nodded, her heart racing. At home, Sophie replayed his words, the warmth in his tone contrasting starkly with the cold silence she now shared with John. She stood at the threshold of change that could alter her life forever. Every step felt like a test, every decision a turning point, and deep down, she wasn't sure which path she wanted to take. The corporate event buzzed with energy, a carefully orchestrated mix of elegance and informality. Sophie had been hesitant to attend, still reeling from the distance growing between her and John. Their conversations had become more strained, and every night, the space between them felt wider, but her presence was expected, an obligation she couldn't easily avoid. The air was thick with the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional bursts of laughter. She moved through the crowd, offering polite smiles and empty pleasantries, but her mind was elsewhere. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to think about the growing distance in her marriage, or the gnawing loneliness she couldn't escape. But there she was, a part of the spectacle, trying to seem engaged while her thoughts drifted to the tension at home. She spotted Richard almost immediately. He was surrounded by a group of colleagues, his charm and easy demeanor making him the center of attention. His laughter was loud, confident, and Sophie felt a strange pull toward him. Even though she tried to ignore it, the room seemed to conspire against her, drawing her closer to him. Inevitably, they ended up near each other, sharing polite smiles and casual greetings. "Having fun?" Richard asked, his eyes glinting with a hint of mischief. "Trying to," Sophie replied, offering a small smile. "It's just a lot to take in." He nodded knowingly. "I get it. Work events can be overwhelming. But you look good tonight." The compliment hung in the air, lingering longer than she expected. Sophie felt a small flush creep up her neck, but she quickly dismissed it. "Thanks," she said, but her smile felt stiff. As the evening wore on, the wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and softening inhibitions. Sophie found herself standing near Richard again, this time at the bar, his easy presence offering her a welcome distraction. The noise of the party seemed to fade, creating a bubble around them, an illusion of privacy amidst the chaos. "You look tired," Richard said, his voice low, laced with genuine concern. "Everything okay?" Sophie hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She had been keeping so much bottled up for so long. "Just a lot on my mind," she replied, surprised by how easily the words left her mouth. Richard leaned slightly closer, his presence both comforting and unnerving. "If you ever need to talk, Sophie, I'm here," he said quietly. Her smile was strained, forced out of politeness. "Thanks, but I'm fine." Richard didn't press further, but he didn't move away either. They fell into conversation, initially about work, then veering into more personal territory. Sophie was surprised at how easily the words flowed between them. He listened in a way John had lately, his questions probing but gentle. They discussed their frustrations, their fears, and their hopes, as if they were old friends, reconnecting after years apart. She didn't even notice how comfortable she felt, how easy it was to talk to him. The music shifted to a slower tempo, and the crowd thinned slightly as people moved to the dance floor. The dim lighting, the intimate atmosphere, the low hum of conversation had all contributed to a sense of detachment from reality. For the first time in what felt like ages, Sophie felt seen, heard. She didn't realize how much wine she had consumed until she laughed at something Richard said and felt the room sway slightly. It wasn't the alcohol, exactly, but the feeling that this moment could be something different, something more. Richard's hand brushed hers as he steadied her, the electric contact sending a jolt of warmth through her body. She frowned, her breath catching in her throat. "Sorry," he murmured, but his hand lingered for a fraction of a second too long. Sophie's heart raced, and she pulled away, trying to dismiss the moment. "I think I need some air," she said, her voice tight. It was meant to sound casual, but it came out more desperate than she intended. Richard gave a small nod, following her without a word, and together they slipped outside to the quiet terrace. The cool night air hit Sophie like a sharp slap, clearing her head but doing little to quell the turmoil inside her. She needed distance from him, from herself, from the weight of everything she had been hiding. "Sophie," Richard began, his tone serious now, "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." She turned to face him, the vulnerability in his eyes catching her off guard. There was a softness in his expression she hadn't noticed before, and something about it made her breath hitch. "You didn't. It's just complicated," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said softly, stepping closer. His presence seemed to pull at her, drawing her in with an invisible force. "I feel it too." The tension between them was palpable, charged with something that was both thrilling and terrifying. Sophie felt herself drawn to him despite every warning screaming in her mind. "Richard, we shouldn't." He interrupted her, his voice a whisper, urgent and raw. "I know, but sometimes it feels like we can't help what we feel." Her resolve crumbled in that moment. The weight of her unhappiness, the longing for connection, and the intoxicating mix of fear and desire overwhelmed her. Before she could think, their lips met in a kiss that was both urgent and tentative, a collision of guilt and passion. It lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, everything Sophie had been holding back seemed to break open. The kiss was a blur of emotion, regret, desire, confusion, everything tangled together. When they broke apart, Sophie's breath hitched, and she stumbled back, her hand instinctively covering her mouth, as if she could somehow erase what had just happened. "I can't do this," she said, her voice shaking, the reality of what she had just done hitting her like a physical blow. Richard nodded, regret flashing in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Sophie, I shouldn't have." "Don't," she interrupted, her tone sharper than she intended. "I need to go." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked quickly back into the building, her heart hammering in her chest. The party had become a blur. She went through the motions, exchanging pleasantries with colleagues, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the kiss over and over again. It felt like a violation of everything she had tried to hold on to, everything she had once believed in, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that it had been more than just a mistake. When Sophie got home that night, the reality of her actions hit her like a tidal wave. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. John was asleep on the couch, the television still playing softly in the background, the glow of the screen casting a pale light across his face. Sophie stood in the doorway, her heart pounding with guilt and shame. She wanted to wake him, to confess everything, to beg for forgiveness, but the fear of losing him, of destroying the life they had built, paralyzed her. Instead, she retreated to their bedroom, the weight of her secret suffocating her with each step. The moment she closed the door behind her, the tears came, silent and heavy, soaking into her pillow as she curled into herself. The sting of the kiss, the guilt, and the growing sense of betrayal haunted her in the stillness of the night. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and somehow, she knew, nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were unbearable. Sophie tried to bury herself in work, hoping that the chaos of her professional life would distract her from the ever-growing tension at home. But every time she saw Richard in the office, or even caught his scent lingering in the air, she was reminded of what she had done. She avoided him at all costs, keeping their interactions strictly professional, and even that felt like a betrayal. She couldn't look him in the eye without feeling her stomach twist with guilt. Her skin burned whenever she thought about the way his touch had felt, how wrong it had been, but how real it had seemed in the moment. Her heart had been torn into pieces, and now she was left to pick them up, but each shard seemed to cut deeper as she tried to put herself back together. At home, things were no better. Sophie and John continued to drift further apart, each of them feeling the weight of the other's silence. The apartment, once filled with the hum of shared moments and laughter, felt like a hollow shell. The love they had once shared seemed to be fading with each passing day, and Sophie couldn't even look at him without feeling the unbearable guilt settle like a stone in her chest. "You've been quiet lately," John remarked one evening as they Saturday at the dinner table. The silence between them was oppressive, broken only by the soft clinking of silverware against plates, the rhythm of mundane life that felt too loud, too painfully normal. Sophie glanced up, startled, and forced a smile. "Just tired," she replied, pushing her foot around her plate. It felt as though the weight of her confession was pressing down on her chest, and she could barely breathe. "You sure that's all it is?" he asked again, his voice quiet but with a note of concern that she couldn't escape. Sophie's eyes darted away, looking anywhere but at him. Yeah, just work stress. But John wasn't convinced. He didn't press her further. But the next few days were filled with a heavy tension, the kind that settles in your bones and never quite lets go. Sophie tried to push him away, focusing on work or retreating into her thoughts, but her avoidance only seemed to make him more suspicious. As the days wore on, the house felt like a cage. Sophie could feel John's growing concern and anxiety. The way he watched her more closely now, she would catch him staring at her when he thought she wasn't looking, his brow furrowed in confusion and hurt. It was as if he could sense something was wrong, but couldn't pinpoint what. The little things where her gaze darted when he spoke to her, the way she avoided his touch weren't lost on him. One evening, as they sat in their living room, Sophie stared blankly at the television, trying to will the thoughts from her mind. But John, finally unable to take it any longer, turned to her with a quiet intensity that caught her off guard. "Sophie, what's going on?" His voice was almost pleading. "You've been distant for weeks. Did I do something?" The question hung in the air, so simple yet so painful. Sophie's stomach twisted, and she felt a deep ache in her chest. She couldn't lie to him anymore. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine, when she knew the truth was destroying her from the inside out. Her mouth went dry. She opened her mouth, ready to deny it all, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain what she had done? How could she admit that she had betrayed him in the worst possible way? "John," she said finally, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you." He looked at her, his expression shifting from concern to something else, to something darker, more fearful. He seemed to sense that the moment was coming, that the thing he had been waiting for had finally arrived. He set his drink down, his gaze never leaving hers. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, almost afraid to know. Sophie took a deep breath, wiping her eyes as tears began to form. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake." Her voice cracked, and she choked on the words, the weight of them too much to bear. John's eyes widened in disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, his face pale as he tried to process what she had just said. The air seemed to thicken around them, and for a moment, Sophie could see the hope in his eyes, the desperate need for it to be something else, something fixable, but she knew it wasn't. "What kind of mistake?" he asked, his voice strained, as if he already knew what was coming, but couldn't stop the question from escaping. Sophie looked down, her hands trembling in her lap. She had never been this broken, this lost. She couldn't meet his gaze, not now, not when everything she had done was about to be laid bare. "I guess someone," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "at the work event." The room seemed to fall silent, the weight of her admission suffocating the air. John's face drained of color, and he frowned, staring at her as if she had just spoken a language he didn't understand. Sophie felt the room spinning around her, the fear and guilt crushing her from all sides. Her stomach churned with shame, but she couldn't take it back. John opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, thick and unbearable. Finally, he whispered, "Oh." His voice was low and tight, as if he already feared the answer. Sophie closed her eyes, unable to look at him. "Richard," she said, barely able to get the name out. John's face twisted in a mix of shock and disbelief. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor with an almost violent noise. "Richard," he repeated, his voice rising, full of hurt and confusion. "The man I trusted, the man I considered a friend." Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't planned, John. It just happened. I never meant for this to." "Don't," he interrupted sharply, his voice rising in anger. "Don't tell me it just happened. That's not an excuse. That's not something I can just forget." His fist clenched at his sides as it paced the room, and Sophie watched him, helpless. Her body shook as she tried to find the right words, but nothing seemed enough. Nothing could make this right. "I can't believe this," he muttered, barely able to speak, his voice breaking. "I can't believe you." "I'm so sorry," she said, the words tumbling out, broken and desperate. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've broken your trust. But please, John, please don't give up on us." But John wasn't listening. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with so much pain, so much disappointment. His voice cracked as he spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Sophie. I don't know if I can even look at you right now." With that, he turned and walked out of the room. The door slammed shut behind him, and Sophie collapsed on the couch, her whole body shaking with the weight of what she had done. She had broken him. She had broken them. The silence that followed was deafening.